Hey, peace, peace. This is your brother Garfield, and this is the third interview in the Scholars 20 for 20 for the month of February, Black History Month. But we have a bunch of scholars from all walks of life that we're going to actually have a conversation with. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm presenting to you for the first time coming to the conscious community. Well, not the first time because a number of us have read his book, but this is Dr. Bruce Haynes, a sociologist who took a journey from Harlem, New York to where he is today. He's currently at UC, what is it, UC Irvine in
UC
California?
Davis.
Right.
UC Davis.
Okay, UC Davis. There you go. And I want to introduce him to the world. So peace and love to you, Dr. Haynes. How are you doing today?
I'm very good today, Brother Garfield. Thanks for having me on.
All right, all right. So let me take this, share this flyer on so we have a bigger space on the screen.
Perfect.
All right. So here we are right now. Here we are, official now. All right. So the first thing I would like to ask you before we even get into an interview is tell us a little about your background of who you are and how you got to where you are today.
I appreciate that. I'm born and raised in Harlem. I grew up on Convent Avenue. I was lucky enough to grow up in a brownstone. So both of my parents were social workers in Harlem. And I got mugged in third grade and put in prep school. My parents were, actually it was second grade, in the bathroom at school. And so that put me on a new journey. And it so happened I was actually in a predominantly Jewish prep school. So I grew up around a lot of Jews while I lived in Harlem. And I think the other thing that's probably most relevant about my background, when I was very young, I got a nanny who was a Seventh-day Adventist, a matron within the Seventh-day Adventist church in Harlem. And so I grew up, though my parents were not Seventh-day Adventists, I went to church retreats. I did vacation Bible school. I was a counselor in vacation Bible school. In so many respects, I grew up within that Seventh-day Adventist tradition, even though it wasn't my own. And I also sang in an Episcopal choir for 5 years.
Okay.
And so from age 9 to 13, or 8 and 9 to 13, I sang for the little church around the corner, which is this predominantly white Episcopal choir on 29th Street. And so that was interesting because that had to do with my mother's experience in the arts, and she was very much interested in getting me involved in the arts. And so I was an artist and sort of the Harlem arts growing up, things like the Amos Repertory Theater and things like that. All right. All those things had a sort of impact on how I see the world, I guess.
Okay, that's a very interesting background. Very, very interesting background. So now, let me ask you this. In your early years, right, as far as researching, research, how in tune were you from a sociological point of view as far as a Black-Jewish relationship? How were you ever in tune in that before you decided?
Well, yes, in fact, and this is how I got in tune with it. I went to CUNY Graduate Center at New York and got my PhD in 1995. It so happened I got lucky and landed my first job at Yale University. And it was during that time that a scholar named Phil Kasinitz, a Jewish scholar, came to CUNY Graduate Center. And he approached me about working on what was going on in Harlem at the time, which was a conflict between Blacks and Jews. It was kind of a very public conflict. And this one involved a fire at a Freddy's Fashion Mart. And it involved Jews, and it involved a kind of public narrative that pitted Blacks and Jews against one another. And so Phil Kasinitz and I wrote a piece that challenged the trope that the media was using because the fight was between a South African merchant who was subleasing from a Syrian Jewish merchant who was subleasing from a black church. So needless to say, it was a complicated thing. Mm-hmm. And we came in, it was framed as, the romantic alliance between blacks and Jews had come to an end. The civil rights tradition had come to an end. And we looked at this and said, well, but these aren't even the same blacks and Jews. This is a South African Jew, South African black, and a Syrian Jew, not Eastern European Jews and black migrants or West Indians, right? And so we weren't even talking about the same groups of people any longer, but the media trope was a conflict between blacks and Jews. So I wrote about that, and that got me interested because there was a public discourse taking place where people were saying, the alliance between blacks and Jews was over. And to be quite frank, I got my position, or got my break to get my position, in part because of a Jewish scholar. So let me run it back to when I got out of college, 1982. I tried to get into the corporate world, and I was barred at every opportunity. And so I was working for a school bus company as a school bus driver dispatcher with my college degree, okay? And it was at that time I was introduced to a guy named Jay Schulman, who was doing jury selection in the courts in New York City. And I started working for Jay Schulman, and I was sort of his right-hand man, so to speak, and he trained me in social science, and then he encouraged me to go to graduate school. And so this Jewish left-wing intellectual who defended the Chicago 7, he defended Dr. Spock cases, he defended Black and Puerto Rican students who struck at City College back in the 70s. And so this was a radical Jewish guy who became my mentor. Mm-hmm. And literally, if it was not for him, I'm not sure where the trajectory of my life was headed. I was literally headed into a company to sell used school buses, which was not something I was looking forward to at the time.
Okay.
And so I saw a different set of dynamics between blacks and Jews in my own life. But meanwhile, there's this public discourse that said, blacks and Jews have nothing going together any longer. And at the same time, I recognized that certain Jews were becoming more conservative than they had been back in the 50s and 60s. And so I kind of entered into thinking about, well, what is this dynamic? What is the history of relationship between blacks and Jews? Why are we in dialogue together? What's the big deal? Like, why are people so preoccupied with this dynamic that we call West Indians, black Jews, and we have all these sort of interesting discourses between blacks and Jews. So that's why I decided I wanted to study the problem. Race is at the heart of this. I don't know why, and I want to take a look at it.
Okay. That's very interesting. All right. So let's get to the book that I would like to talk about and stuff that's contained in it. And one of the things I like about this book is your approach. You're not what's called an ethnologist. That's not your lane. If I mispronounce it right. But sociology is an issue here. It's not really an issue, but you're coming from that perspective, which is different for me because I'm not a sociology guy, but what made you, what research did you put in? I mean, I'm aware of it because I read the book, but I want the audience to know what type of research did you put in for the Souls of Judaism? Because at the onset of it, it's also called African Jews in America, or Black American Jews with a African descent, something to that effect. So what did you research and how did you research to get this book done?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm not even sure where to begin.
Take your time.
It started with some naive questions that came from myself. So I'm teaching at Yale University. My wife happens to be Jewish, Ashkenazi Jew. And she was a secular Jew when we got married, as far as I knew. And suddenly we moved to New Haven. We leave sort of Jewish New York, and New Haven's a very different environment. And she says, "Oh, I need to join a synagogue." So I'm like, "Oh, okay." So now I'm the black guy at the synagogue, literally. And I started thinking, and meanwhile, this conversation was taking place about blacks and Jews, but people were treating me pretty nicely at this synagogue. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really fascinating. They're talking about this in public, but these are my experiences. Meanwhile, I happen to notice there are a couple of black families in this congregation. I'm like, wow. Now, when I say I grew up with Jewish kids in New York, I went to bar mitzvahs in 1973. I had 13-year-old Jewish friends. And so I was the only black person with my big fro at the synagogue. And so I heard all sorts of things from the old timers saying, "Oh, shvatza," which was both a derogatory and a descriptive term, right? And so I kind of grew up as very much as a black person in this Jewish context. Now I'm hearing people are saying blacks and Jews are in conflict, but I'm seeing black Jews who are practicing Judaism. So I'm like, okay, who are these people? And literally that became the start of my project. Meanwhile, at Yale University, I will say, I met a very dynamic young man who was studying theology, and his name was Walter Isaac. And he came out of the Israelite tradition. And I have to say, Walter gave me a lot of background because I didn't know too much. And so you might say he was a guide for me as I started learning about different traditions within the black community, watching people cross traditions. And in fact, that's what Walter was doing. He was teaching Hebrew in a Ashkenazi Reform synagogue, but he was not from an Ashkenazi background. So this, very black gentleman from a very different understanding of Judaism. And then I'm thinking, okay, this is not making sense here, because I grew up in Harlem and I didn't. And then I started thinking back, well, yes, you used to see people, right? You had what we used to refer to as street theater of different religious groups on 125th Street, vying for attention. And then I remembered back to different Israelite groups that maybe I'd come in contact with, but I had never really paid much attention to them. They were just part of the life of Harlem for me. Now they sort of had meaning, and I had a curiosity about why these groups existed and what did they believe, and what did that have to do with race and Judaism. And so literally I spent the next 20 years. Now I think of this, I started this in 1998. I published the book in 2018. So I spent a lot of time first getting information from people who said they were black and Jewish, and then spending a lot of years trying to make sense of what is it that I have. I've got all these interviews. They're really fascinating stories. But what am I looking at? What is the thing I'm looking at? And I settled on coming to an idea about seeing how treated in very racial ways during the early modern era, and starting to see a very strong relationship between the way Europeans were treating Jews as others, and when those Europeans were now coming into contact with Africans in the transatlantic slave trade and in the Arab slave trade that overlapped, and that there was something to this conversation. So that's what I started exploring. I started looking closely, and this is where I settled on the notion of racialization and started realizing that, in fact, Jews were navigating the color line in the same way that black folks were. But we never talk about Jews in that way. And so in thinking about Jewish history for 500 years in the aftermath of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, I started recognizing that Jews have only been white people since like yesterday, in terms of how history has been talking about Jews, in terms of how the Western discourse has been talking about Jews. And then I started wondering, so why would these Africans, people of African descent, say they were Jewish. And suddenly I thought, aha, because there is an alternative way of thinking about identity that the Bible is offering. And they are drawing on this biblical text to reframe their legitimacy within a racial discourse. And I came to this conclusion in part because a real brilliant scholar I met a long time ago named Clarence Walker wrote a book about Afrocentrism. And the book was called You Can't Go Home Again. And it was a scathing critique of Afrocentrism. It was literally saying, we can't go back to the days of the kings and queens, they're gone. And it was so dismissive of so many elements of Black culture. I was torn by, there's something else there. There is something else going on within the discourse of Black culture that simply can't be dismissed as Black people just made it up. Black people didn't know who they were in slavery, and now they have reinvented themselves. And I thought that seems so simplistic. Is that how people really go through time? Or do people create collective memories through families and traditions and try to hold on to traditions and try to rekindle traditions? And suddenly I thought, aha, now as I started seeing the overlap of Africans and Jews in the Caribbean world, I started seeing the possibility for another way of seeing these identities, another ways of seeing these claims, both as legitimate in terms of people who had real Jewish history, but also as a rhetorical device for people who are overwhelmingly not trained, right? We don't get formal education, particularly when we're talking about the 1910s and 20s. And the religious tradition is mostly untrained scholars. So how do you take that position of not being formally trained against a society that is using science to reduce you to non-existence, right? Because that's what we're up against, this sort of scientific, rational society. And then that's when I started understanding the use of rhetoric, the use of language to make claims and to offer an alternative cosmology of the world. And suddenly I thought, now this makes sense. So this isn't about making up something. This is about claiming humanity. And in the same way that states make fictitious notions about their origins, whether it's Mossad for Israel or Custer's Last Stance for the United States. These are fictions, and we live off of these fictions. And I suddenly realized, yes, this is what we're always doing, creating fictions to hold the group together in a way that gives the group honor and legitimacy and a sense of pride in opposition to a society that was bent on stripping Black people of that pride.
Oh, well said. Let me ask you this. Who were some of the groups you researched while writing this book? Because there's let me explain to you, and let me just say to the audience real quickly that this particular book by my friend here, Dr. Bruce Haynes, is now a mandatory reading. Curtis, I'm recommending it as mandatory reading for Black folks in America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, to understand this whole paradigm of Judaism and Blacks and people gravitating to want to be a Jew. So this particular book, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, I am saying right now, before the show is over, because I might forget, is mandatory reading for anyone that follows my YouTube channel, Facebook. I am this is top 10. You know, the rapper said top 10 dead or alive. I'm telling you right now, this is top 10 reading. And before I got into the interview today, I had the book on my computer and I said, let me review some of the stuff that we read before, because I read it like a year ago. And reading it now, it's better. than reading it the first time, my brother. I have to be honest. And
Thank you.
you touched on stuff. You brought a point, and I said it to the guys in my back chat today, that Judaism, before the temple fell, was a temple religion. After that, it became a book religion. And I'm like, wow, I never thought of that. And that was reviewing your book. That means when I read it the first time, it never registered. Now it registered the second time I'm reading your book. But ladies and gentlemen, that's a very important part. We're not going to really talk about that because that's not what he's here for. But can you just tell us who are some of the groups you interviewed over the 20-year period in your life that really helped you with this book?
First, I have to say Rabbi Capers Finney. My hat's off to him. He was generous with his time. He was generous with his knowledge. And he was open about his history, which is very important. The Israelite community, the Hebrew Israelite community, is a broadly defined community. It's no different than what we'd say the Christian community. And so that includes, the white supremacists as well as the black folks who voted for Biden. And so, in the same way, you might say the Hebrew Israelite world is exactly that diverse. And so part of what I was trying to do was zero in on some of the groups that seem to have had traditions that have survived over time and that were seemingly becoming part of a broad conversation. Okay. So let me say this. I began this project in the late 1990s, and it so happened this was the beginning of the internet age. And so many groups and individuals reached out to each other on the internet. And so I was sort of right there at a time when many different Israelite groups were connecting to one another, realizing that, oh, wow, we have similar traditions. We're in Chicago. We didn't know you were over in Philly. And so there was all of this kind of networking taking place. There was transformations taking place within the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in New York as they went through leadership transformations. And so they loomed large in the conversation, I guess, because they were one of the first groups that were recognized within the mainstream literature on Black Jews and Black Judaism. And so the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in New York, you might say, had become public figures even by the 1930s, where you had Ashkenazi Jews who came up to Harlem to visit their congregation and see Black folks speaking Yiddish. And and so I found them in the media, and then I found books like Harold Brotz's work, and so there are some works done in the 70s, and mostly done by Ashkenazi Jews who are looking at Black Jewish groups as religious cults. And they came with a particular orientation. They came with the orientation, are these people real Jews? And I found that orientation kind of problematic, in part because there was so much of a rich conversation amongst Jews about, well, who's a real Jew? I mean, Jews were debating amongst themselves. When I say Jews, normative Jews, were debating amongst themselves who's a Jew. And so I thought, well, how do we know these things? And so that led me into a journey. I spoke with members from Church and God and Saints in Christ, so the Crowdies, the Cherries. I spoke with members of Temple Bethel in Philadelphia. And then I would meet isolated, funny people, even within my own family circle. One who was, the relationship was my mother's secretary's husband at the Community Mental Health Center where she worked in Harlem. They were raising their children as Israelite, but they did not belong to any congregation. And so I started realizing, oh, this is really interesting. Just like Christian, you got Christians, you don't have to belong to a church. They said they're Christian. I'm thinking, so this got me thinking also about what is Black religion and how do we practice religion? And that's when I realized that, Afro-American religion is very African in its syncretic nature. In that like my mother, whose mother was Catholic, put me in an Episcopal choir and used to go into the cathedrals and light candles regularly. Like for her, she stepped into a church, God was there. She didn't care whose church it was. And so this notion of more fluid notion of religion and relationship to God got me thinking about how did the Africans engage with Judaism when they first encountered it in the Caribbean, say, and why would people be drawn to Judaism? And so there I started expanding out of sort of Black congregations and starting to look at other people who said they were Black and Jewish, including those who had converted to formal Judaism. I learned about Israelite notions of reverting, that people said, well, we were not converting, of changing to something new. We were going back to something that we had once been. And so this notion of reverting was very strong within the Hebrew Israelite community. But also there were divides within the Hebrew Israelite community over what's the relationship to Israel, what's the relationship to their Ashkenazi brethren, what's the role of race in the conversation. So what I wanted to do with this book, you might say I wanted to write the definitive book on the topic. I wanted to capture all the dimensions and make sense of them. Because in some ways, sociology is asking very simple questions about why do people do the things they do? And that's what I want to know. Why are Black people doing these things? Why are certain conversations about Ethiopia, for instance, coming up within Hebrew Israelite conversations as well as within Christian conversations? What's the overlap here? Mm-hmm. And I have to say, lucky for me, having been so trained in with my nanny, because I was 22 months till age 12 or so, I was with her every summer and every afternoon. So she taught me to pray. I know all my Bible stories. But that gave me an insight into the dynamic between Christianity and Judaism that I never understood before. And that became fascinating for me as a scholar and a historian, understanding that Christianity gave birth to Judaism and that there was a conversation taking place between them, in a sense, about certain claims in relationship to God, and that all of these were revolving around these biblical texts. And the texts were sort of a source of authority, so to speak.
When you say Christianity gave birth to Judaism, do you mean Judaism gave birth to Christianity? Or you mean
exactly. I'm sorry, exactly. That's exactly what I mean. Thank you. Now, thanks for catching that.
Let's look at some of the encounters. I'm sure some of your encounters. You got a chapter about encounters. It's like my favorite chapter in the book. How do you separate Black Judaism from the Israelite Black identity? That's kind of like it's a weird type of question, because Black Judaism does include Israelite claimants, but I'm talking about the guys who you interviewed who were on the One West doctrine, or some of those guys you'll be seeing on the street corners and so forth. They have a certain doctrine that they're claiming an Israelite Black identity. So they are different than, say, for example, you in New Haven going into the synagogue and your wife is following this tradition and you now convert to this tradition.
Precisely.
And now you are a Jew. So now nobody could say you are following Black Judaism based on your faith of choice.
Okay, so let me bring up the Abu Yudea, which I found fascinating, right? Yeah. So this is a group that is in Uganda.
Uganda, right.
In the 1930s, the tribal leader says, I think we're Jewish. We're making the whole community Jewish. Mm-hmm. So they start very much like many Israelite groups, a kind of organic practice of Judaism.
Right.
But at some point, many of their members decided they wanted a normative recognition within the Jewish world, which required being a halakhic tradition precisely within the traditional rabbinic framework. Mm-hmm. Well, many decided that's what they wanted. Some said they did not want
Wow.
So the tribe, there are some who stayed in Uganda who did not convert, but many chose to convert. Who's right? I don't know. That's the kind of question you're asking. But I guess what I'm saying is, even there, we see, even within one tradition, people take different trajectories in their understanding of what they're doing. And I think it's the same. One of the things that became fascinating for me is the use of language itself, so that I'm not even convinced if someone says I'm a Christian and you're a Christian, how do we know we really believe the same things? Do we really? So there's an implied sense of unity here, right? And I think that's what we're talking about when people are invoking these terms. There's sort of this implied sense of unity. And then you have to get down to talk to them about what is it that they actually mean. Because some Israelites will use the term Jew and at the same time say, but I'm not talking about those white Jews because they're not real Jews.
Right.
And then others will say, no, I don't use the word Jewish. That's the white term. I'm a Hebrew Israel. So you have different discourses taking place over the meanings of words and terms themselves.
Okay. All right. So you have a chapter. It's on the screen for the folks to see at home. The Soul of Judaism, Black Jewish Encounters in the New World. So you talk about the first encounters and so forth, but you made a point at the bottom of this page. Jews had been active in the Ottoman slave trade from antiquity through the 19th century. And there is strong evidence that they owned sub-Saharan African and Ethiopian slaves as well as Muslims in Egypt. And of course, this is from, you put the source, Jonathan Schorsch, who I will be interviewing, by the way, on the 17th of this month. He's going to probably be number 10 or 12, the scholar that I interview. But while slavery, this is very important because we have evidence that they owned sub-Saharan Africans and Ethiopian slaves as well as Muslims in Egypt. While slavery was widespread in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, certain groups, including Moors, heretics, and Jews, were at times forbidden to own Christian slaves. Now, let's move down a little bit. We have, although we know that many African slaves were converted to Judaism, in the 1400s, legislation in Castile banned Christian women from nursing or raising Jewish children and forbade living Christian servants. Now, it goes further on, and this is the route that I'd love for you to go in. At the bottom of the page, scholars have identified the importance of the Atlantic in shaping the African and Jewish diasporas, which intersected in colonial society. After Portugal and Spain joined under a single monarch in 1580, many Jews and conversos fled first to the Netherlands, where they could openly practice their Judaism, and later to Dutch and British controlled areas in the New World, such as Curacao and Suriname, Jamaica, Barbados, which offered them varying degrees of religious and national freedom. I want to stop right there. It seems now I'm living in a world, my brother, where people who are sub-Saharan Africans who came over on the slave trade as slaves are saying now that they are the people who ran away to Curacao and Suriname. They are connected to them, who were, some of them were slave owners. How are we now, as the slaves, connecting ourselves to the slave owners before, without even thinking about Judaism for a second? It's like more psychological than sociological. But help me out, because you're the sociologist.
I'm not quite sure the question you're asking.
I'm asking, why would African Americans who came over as descendants of slaves be claiming that they are Jews, right? They're descendants of Jews, but come to find out, the folks who helped in some of the instances of financing or carrying them over to the slave trade were actual Jews who owned slaves.
Well, okay, so here's what I think is fascinating about the story itself. In the conversation of between blacks and Jews, it seemed to me that everybody wanted, or most people wanted, simplistic stories. And what I discovered was a story that was far more complicated and convoluted than anyone would expect. And so, to me, there's this great irony that we're talking about the birth of colonialism. But in Europe, Jews, as well as Gypsies and the Roma people, right? These are the others of Europe. So Jews can't practice their religion. They're persecuted. And so they're fleeing into the Caribbean and in this sort of intermediary space, so to speak, that allows them, well, if you guys are going to fill this void and be the traders, we'll let you have your freedom. What a devil's bargain. That's precisely how I'm looking at that. That was what a devil's bargain. But on the other hand, they're merchants. Are they really Jews? Do these guys go to synagogue? Or is it just they just happen to be Jewish ancestry? So what do we mean by when we say they're Jewish? See, so this is where I'm thinking, well, wait, it's not the religious Jews that are practicing this. These are merchants. They're no different than the Christians. We don't blame Christianity on what they're doing anymore, right? So there's a kind of disconnect there in terms of isolating them. Is it because they're Jews, or is it happenstance that they're Jews, so to speak? And so what I'm saying is, what I see them is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Whiteness is yet to be developed as a colonial political gatekeeper. So between the 1680s and 1720s, whiteness solidifies in the colonial world. And in that pre-colonial era, that's where we see Jews sort of acting on their Jewish beliefs. Do you hear me?
I hear you. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
Okay, sorry. You see Jews acting on their Jewish beliefs, and which basically said, well, if the Africans are going to touch our food, if we're going to intermarry, we need to engage in these rituals, to the point where in Suriname we have a whole community of mixed race Black Jews, right? And we see it's right at the point where the color line becomes solidified in the colonial world that we see these Jews out on the outpost, so to speak, have to make a choice. Are we going to stay with our traditions of what we did and still, connect with our brethren here who are part African, or do we draw the color line and go into the colonial world as white folks? And it's clearly, I'm saying that's the choice that gets made. And that's when they split off with their Caribbean brethren. And we see a split in the Surinamese Jewish community, which I found fascinating. Like literally the whole mixed race community breaks off from the Sephardic Jewish community. And these are Sephardic Jews, not Ashkenazi Jews, meaning they're from North Africa and Spain, as opposed to South and Eastern Europe.
Wow, that's fascinating. And this is in Suriname.
Suriname became the place that I found most documented. I also found it interesting that Suriname was the place that Jewish scholars knew 50 years ago that you had these mixed race offspring. But here, this is where you have this interesting conflation or coincidence between their choice to not recognize patrilineal descent. So they're not Jewish because they have Jewish fathers, as opposed to having Jewish mothers, right? So they're not traditionally Jewish. They say, well, we don't have to pay any attention to them. Not because they're Black, because they're not real Jews. But I thought that was a convenient decision made by Jewish intellectuals in the 1960s who did have an understanding that things were a little more complicated than anybody wanted to talk about. And that you had these cases particularly in Suriname, but I also believe likely in Barbados and Jamaica, just giving the surnames that we have and the symbolisms that we have within those cultures of Judaism, which are very strong, just as they are in Brazil, where you have
Mm.
Jewish names floating around black families.
You gave a statistic about Brazil, like over the years, pretty much the Sephardic Jews would convert their maids or slaves, and sometimes converting to Judaism will help to free them. Can you speak about um that particular group? Can you hear me? Because I think
Yes, so there was some interesting. I'm
hold on
looking
one
at.
second. I think you're frozen. I don't know if you need to go out and come back in. I
Okay.
think yeah, because your screen is frozen.
My
Unless you could talk and I could hear you clearly. Okay.
Can you hear me? No, I
No,
think I'm
not
frozen.
clear at all. You probably just have to just log out and log and come right back in.
Okay, let me
Yeah, let's
see.
try that. Yeah, let's try that. Yeah, in the meantime, let me just read some of this until the brother comes back on. All right. My apologies, family.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we got like 10 more minutes, but let's get it in, man. Let's get it in. We were at the point where we were talking about the folks in Suriname. It was blowing a lot of people's minds. And would what would
My apologies. Wonderful.
all right, hold on. All right. So now where were we at this point? We were
Okay, well, you're asking me about, I guess the Brazilian traditions and what was going on with both the maroon populations, but also, well, and I think you're really drawing on page 70 to 71 here in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where this is actually, I'm drawing heavily on Jonathan Shor's material. And, I'm basically, I think the most important part starts here. And maybe I'll preface this with saying, one of the things that fascinated me as a sociologist, somewhat engaging in a different field, because you might say I'm really engaged in conversation with historians here.
Right.
Is that I started realizing that, boy, people make a lot of claims off of a little bit of evidence. And so from a more empirical science, where sociology, we need quite a bit of evidence to make claims, I started thinking, wow, are these claims true? How do we know these claims are true? So part of what I'm doing is reading the historical evidence and the absence of evidence in a different way than past scholars have done. Mm-hmm. And I realized that's really what I was doing. So, for example, when I say here on page 70, according to the congressional minutes of the Jewish community in Paramaribo in Brazil, they have in their minutes, a slave shall not be circumcised without first having been freed by his master, so that the master should not be able to sell him from the moment the slave will have bound himself to Judaism. Well, what I infer from that is, well, why do you need a rule against it if it wasn't happening?
Wow.
And this is how I'm saying I am interpreting the historical evidence a little bit differently than other people. It doesn't say that we circumcise slaves, but if you're saying you have to make a rule that you can't do it unless they're circumcised, what do you say?
Yep.
Right. So
2 + 2 is 4. Mm-hmm.
And I think, I'll be curious to see how you said you're going to have Professor Schorsch on. Right. And I'm really curious to see how he responds to my interpretation, so to speak, of his historical evidence. Because he might say, oh, that's completely bogus. I'm reading too much into it. And I think that's one of the interesting problems about history. I found the same dilemma with trying to understand the Ethiopian Hebrews. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, the Beta Israel Ethiopians.
Right.
And so the Beta Israel, they go back to the 4th century, according to the historians. And then things get really muddy. And they say, well, they could be Jewish, they might be Jewish, they could be some leftover Jews, they might have converted some other Jews. I'm like, well, that's a lot of guesswork when you don't know.
Exactly.
And so in the absence of knowing, many people say, well, they're not Jewish.
Right.
Well, how do you conclude that when you just told me you don't know?
But you know what's in your book that's really funny about this whole Ethiopian thing? They come from the tribe of Dan, and in Revelations, it's like everybody throws the tribe of Dan away in the tradition of Christianity. So when somebody says, yeah, you're probably from the tribe of Dan, it's really not a good thing. But because of Eldad the Danite, he was from Dan because he wanted to associate himself with Samson, who was this, guy that was going around beating up everybody. So in his storyline, he had to be from Dan because Dan was connected to Samson, and he beat up these guys who was feeding him to get big and fat to eat him. So he eventually beat them up because he was saved by some other Danites and from some other, So the Danite thing has a lot to do with that, but it also has to do with Dan is not in the 12 tribes in Revelations. So yeah, you black, so you have to be Dan, maybe, because you're really not considered a tribe anymore. In a sense, that has a lot to do with it.
But I see scholars doing this all the time. For example, I found evidence of the story of Ham, and the scholars who study the Ham myth will one group to the other, in part because the religious leaders are reading each other's religious texts, right? So, and so that you can blame Jews, Christians, or Muslims for the Ham story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because in a sense, it was a minor story as a sort of biblical commentary that got elevated in a particular historical period. Well, but I still see scholars, how do I say, being disingenuous to that historical narrative and sort of wanting to make it out how they want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of, I think, choosing to put the evidence in that supports your claim and choosing to leave out the evidence that maybe doesn't support your claim. And what I tried to do was sort of reconcile things and see, well, if they're saying this and they're saying this, where could the story really lie? And that gets messy. And so we don't really know.
Right. One of the rabbis that influenced you was a rabbi out of Chicago. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Fournier, yes.
And you talked about Deuteronomy 28 and how they injected that later on into the whole Israelite identity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This is the princes shall come out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's scripture, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This it's a celebration of the centrality of the temple. But it's one of those interesting phrases that it kind of brings within the Black church this overlap between kind of Christian ideas with Judaic understandings of those ideas, so to speak.
Right.
One of the things that hit me very strongly, and this is drawing from the work of Lawrence Levine in his Black Culture and Black Consciousness book, he has a really nice discussion of slave religion. And if you look at the slave context and the text that slaves left behind and the spirituals, Black religion was overwhelmingly immersed in the Old Testament in a way that identified with the Israelites in a profound way, right? Identified with Moses, the Exodus, the Israelites, the 400 years in wandering, right? Exactly. And so that echoes with this narrative of exile and return, right?
You went into slavery, and now you need some sort of saving. You have the Harriet Tubman, the Denmark VC, the Nat Turner, the Robin, David Walker. You have all these folks saying, "Hey, this is talking about us, the Exodus for us to free." They use it as inspiration and so forth. So to me personally, I look at that as inspiration for Cherry and Crowdy. As far as them coming up with that theology, although it's a church, they had that Black Israelite theology that crept in and started. Although they weren't the only two. After them, you had a couple more. Then, Ford got popular with it, but there was people before Ford in Harlem and so forth speaking the same thing. But it was very inspirational. If I was living in that time, that would help me out. It would help me out. It's like Israel Hill. A lot of the Black Israelite identity folks use Israel Hill without understanding what it really was about. They don't know.
Exactly. And then when you look closely, there are these groups that are actually synthesis of Islam and Judaism, right? That they overlap, in fact. They get even messier in terms of no one knows where to quite place them within traditional categories.
Right.
Right.
Before
So
we
you have.
go, because I have to actually end the show, we're gonna have to set up another. We definitely, because your book is, oh man, it's amazing.
Thank
Um,
you so much. I
yeah,
really.
definitely. I actually was the first one I could proudly say that came to the conscious community with your book. I found it on Google Books and I bought it, and I said, I started telling everybody about it and the information and so forth. But
Kevin Garfield, sorry, let me just say this. What's interesting, when the book first came out, a couple of Israelites wrote me on Facebook and basically told me I was writing white Judaism. And I was
wow,
surprised. I was really taken by it. And so I kind of took that as, oh, wow, some of the Israelites are not going to like what I said. Um, I did my best to give everybody self-respect and not take the position of who was truth. Sociologically, there was no truth.
hey, Dr. Haynes, you know what you should have done? You should have asked him, you read the book? You should have really asked him if they really read the book. Not go on Google and Google a couple of pages and don't like your book, because I don't think they read your book. But I'll say this though. What do you say about converts? Because I'm looking at the Brazil situation, the Suriname situation, the Sephardic. They have maids and servants who are slaves who were treated differently because of the same thing you talked about, the circumcision and becoming a part of Judaism. So you couldn't be, they didn't want you to get into slavery if you're a Jew. It was like a badge of honor at one point to convert to Judaism. My whole thinking is, you talk about converts there's over 150 references to talking about converts in your book. And it seems like to me personally, I call everybody a convert, because Garfield now could go into the temple and become a Jew and practice that religion. I'm a convert now. But how do we separate converts from the outright?
Okay, let me say this. This is a great question, and I actually think I have an answer for it. People have asked me, have I converted to Judaism? And I have been very much involved in the Jewish community here out on the West Coast and in New York. But how would I frame it? I realized that, for instance, when I had a gentleman who's Ethiopian and Yemenite ancestry, who told me every time he left community, he had to go through another circumcision because the rabbis didn't believe about the last group of rabbis.
What?
Yeah, that story's in the book there. It's buried deep in there.
Oh, man.
And so, and this is a gentleman who lives in the Orthodox Brooklyn Jewish community in the Ashkenazi.
Oh, man. Don't tell me we lost Dr. Haynes again. Dr. Haynes, are you there? All right. But in the meantime, his book is on Amazon Kindle for $1.99. I don't know if Sister Mika bought it to Amazon, but Amazon Kindle has it for $1.99 right now today. All right. Go ahead. You got cut off, but go ahead. Continue.
Okay. Yeah. So in traditional rabbinic Judaism, you need three rabbis. It's called a Bet Din, right? And they all agree, and then you go through your process. Well, if some other rabbi doesn't agree that Bet Din is legit, then you got to go through another. And so that's what happened to this Ethiopian. So if that would happen to him, I thought, well, what good is it? So I'm a part of a community here that, I get to do everything in the community that I want to, except pretty much read from Torah, because I can't do that anyway. And so conversion is more about becoming more deeply scholarly and learning about reading Torah and stuff. But it doesn't affect. If I go someplace else, people will still say, are you real, right? And so I concluded that as long as the community accepts me for who I am, it doesn't really matter. That's between me and God.
Right. There you go. But what about these guys on the corner shouting they're Israelite descendants?
Well, we have a long history of street corner preaching, and it takes all different styles: Christian, religious, Jewish, Muslim. Um, and so, rather than trying to sort of throw stones at other people's traditions, I think it's more. What's the word? It's a better way to just ask the questions: why are the people doing what they're doing, and what do they believe? I don't try to measure whether or not their frameworks are better or worse than someone else's framework. But there, of course, there are limits. One of the things that sort of to go against that, one of the things that Rabbinic Judaism does offer is a moral code. And I do think my chapter on conversion talks a lot about why would someone who is Black want to become part of this tradition, want to engage in Jewish practice. And Jewish practice very much is driven by notions of tikkun olam, of healing the world, being engaged in the world. And so there's strong ethical, strong, compelling ethical reasons that draw African Americans to Judaism, just like Islam or Christianity.
Okay. All right. Hey, Dr. Haynes, man, we're going to have some conversations off the air. And you don't know how honored I am to have you on, man. I'm telling you guys, I don't know if you noticed, but your book is on Kindle edition for $1.99 today.
Oh, awesome.
If you say they can't afford the book, don't watch my channel no more. Because if you can't afford $1.99, oh man, I know Corona messed us up economically speaking, but come on now. We all gonna, whoever watches this show, I'm gonna do a show next month just on this book. And I'm gonna invite Dr. Haynes if he's available. If not, we'll just read it.
I would be happy to come back. I'd be happy to come back. It's been a wonderful conversation. You've asked some great questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what, man? Maybe the next one of these days we could talk about the socioeconomic problems we have as a people, and what would your solutions be? You know, maybe
I'd love to. My other work is on segregation.
You're a PhD, man. We got to use you for what you got. You got a sociology. The Hebrew Israelite stuff is good, but come on now, we need solutions at the end of the day. So we got to bring you back to that one day. We got to bring you back.
My pleasure. I'd be happy to. I would be happy.
Hey, thank you, big brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.
All right. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is number 3 in 20 for 20. I have to run. I apologize. But I mean, oh man, I could talk to this brother for 8 hours, man. This brother here is brilliant. And I want to say thank you, Tate Houston. I want to say tomorrow we got 2 interviews tomorrow. We got Dennis McDonald, the Greek influence on the writings of the New Testament. And we have Dr. Josh Bowen, another PhD, that's going to be dropping some information about slavery in the Bible and so forth. All right. So look out for, hey, I'm a Raw Squad. I see y'all in the chat. Y'all coming up sometime next week or whenever y'all want to come on. Y'all know y'all got free reign on here. All right. Hey, Tamika, peace and love to you. Miss Tiffany, much love and respect to your queen. All right. Look at this guy, Blurred Vision, man. I tell you, I love you too, brother. I love you too. All right. Peace and love, family. I got to go pick up Amir. Peace. We out of here. Thank you for watching. Share the show. Tell a friend. Tell a friend. Peace. Dr. Bruce Haynes, Soul of Judaism. Cop it. $1.99 on Amazon Kindle right now. Peace. Whoop, whoop. Sister Mo in the